Chapter 18. Attrition. The demon knew he was under attack. After leaving the village, he had been able to feed his way through the forest, slowly regaining his size and following the direction the voice had come. But at nightfall it happened again, and this time it was louder, stronger. "Goodbye, Janku. I love you." Those words once again sent half of his roiling hulk away in a gust of cool wind. And now again, with half his strength gone, he was smaller than ever. But he surged forward in the direction of the voice, devouring everything in his path. By the afternoon he had expanded significantly, but was still not the size he had been when he attacked the village. He hovered at the icy coastline, roaring into the cold ocean winds. He knew his prey lay across the water, but was reluctant to leave the sustenance of the land. He paused, and then in a hot gust of anger, bolted forward above the sharp tips of the waves. He flew on over the water as evening fell, his momentum increasing with the sense of getting ever closer to the object of his hatred. That's when it happened a third time. "Goodbye, Janku. I love you." This time the power of Thervius' voice very nearly blew the demon apart and scattered him to the indifferent Arctic winds. Once again, half of him blew away, and the scattered soot struggled to regain form. Each mote of ash surged toward an enduring locus of rage. It managed to collect into an amorphous blot. By morning, it had reformed into Janku at the shores of Gren Amar. The demon shot straight up into the air, determined to destroy Thervius as soon as possible. He ignored every impressing peak, flying toward the source of the voice, still lingering on the faithful earth currents. In the far distance was the highest mountain, and Janku sailed directly for it. At the exposed rock, Thervius' scent was everywhere. The rock, in fact, was warm with it. The eyes of the demon blurred and refocused on the surrounding snow. At last, his scent caught the smell of the living brother from the direction of the frozen basin and descending stream. The ashen lips of the demon curled back in hideous delight. He could literally smell the exhales of his despised Thervius. The demon screeched, collected into the sharp-lined Janku, and shot downward toward the stream. Chapter 19. Journey. 4 women stood in the portico in the cloudiness of dawn. None of them had ever traveled away from their home, and now they stood together, invoking protection for their journey and guidance for their task. It was Sophia who prayed. "Creator, architect of life, we come as willing servants to your plan. We abide in your mystery, so that your power will prevail. Guide us so that we may be instruments of your goodness." With their prayers, the 4 women held aloft a white light between them that cast a lunar glow over their faces and the tops of their heads. Marcus watched from the corner, mystified and elated. What they were doing surprised him, and yet at the same time, he felt like he had known this practice all his life. Though his people didn't pray this way, they listened to everything around them, the trees, the animals, the mountain itself. Being able to hear was what kept them alive. It never dawned on them to talk back or more, ask for help. The women closed their prayer and turned to Marcus, who had his pack at his feet. "Now we can go," said Sophia. She stopped and looked at Marcus. She had just met this man yesterday, and now she was going to his home far away, his forlorn and devastated home. He had left seeking help for his people. It was the first time he had ever needed to ask for assistance, all because of the demon and Janku's rage. She was sad, but something was vibrant within her. She realized she was excited to be traveling, and further, she was eager to work alongside this man. The five of them went out into the early morning light, where a team of 8 pack mules stood loaded with food and other supplies. One of the priestesses, Cleo, specialized in cooking. She had brought jars of olive oil, garlic, and onions, sea salt, and as much fruit and vegetables that she thought might survive the journey. She also brought seeds with the intention of building a summer garden for tomatoes, basil, and greens. And one last treasure from her land was a red geranium that she intended to propagate and share with the other women. Another priestess, Daria, was keeper of the stone inscriptions. She had brought her paints and carving tools, along with illuminated scrolls that she would share with the people. Some were filled and some were blank, ready for painting. Lydia was a temple musician, and she had packed an array of stringed instruments in various sizes and as many flutes as she could find. She walked with a flute in her hand, intending to play it when the trail was even. The group descended down the temple trail in a single line. The mules were strong and sure-footed. Sophia and Marcus led, with the 3 other priestesses following behind. The trail was still shady in the early morning light, and the oaks and manzanita exhaled their spice into the new day. Marcus was once again walking behind Sophia. It was a bright morning, and he wanted to ask her a question. "Who were you talking to in there?" Marcus asked. Sophia took a few paces and answered, "The mystery, the great power that is all life." "Why do you talk to it?" "To align our will with divine will, sacred will. It ensures that all our actions are guided by love and not greed or malice. Had we been able to teach a certain young man this practice, we might not have this demon." Marcus thought of the anger that had taken the man's life and eventually half his own village. "My people," he said thoughtfully, "do not talk to the mystery, and yet none of our own has ever become a demon." "If your people are to survive, they will need to begin," said the priestess. "I'm going to teach your people how to talk to the mystery. Because of the demon, they have been attacked by extreme darkness. Now their task is to defend their minds and hearts. Talking to the mystery will help them focus on what is growing, rather than what has been destroyed. They will be able to see what has been given to them, rather than what has been taken away. Their hearts will expand and feel again, rather than contracting in resentment and frustration." Marcus stared at the back of the priestess. He thought of his people holding up the white light together. He thought of himself doing the same. It seemed like a magic that was beyond their abilities. Sophia continued, "The evil you and your people have been exposed to has hollowed you out. You are now capable of much depth, but we must be diligent to fill your depths with light. That is why you will learn to talk to the mystery. It is why you must." Marcus was stunned into silence. His heart ached and yet also surged with admiration at the same time. He felt saturated with loss, and yet, walking behind this woman, he felt more at home than ever. "And what about the other priestesses? What will they do?" "They will help make the light bigger than the memory of evil," Sophia replied. "They will hold up what is good to draw the people's attention away from their disaster." "The trees remind us of what's good," said Marcus, "and the mountain and the streams." "You need more than that now," Sophia continued. "You need an extended hand. You need to receive from other people. You need discovery. You need color and music. You need the light of human life." The temple trail spilled out to the soft coastal road. It ran west for half a day and then turned north into the mountains at an opening in the peaks. The group walked on in the warming sun, and Lydia began playing her flute. The music was a salve to the desolate trail the demon had left. Marcus decided to keep his eye on Sophia's shoulder and nothing else. He was tired of looking at dead trees. He watched the white fabric and listened to the flute. The rhythm of their steps made the morning flow by swiftly. They stopped for lunch at the bend in the road and continued north into the mountains. That evening they camped by a stream that was surrounded by lush vegetation. They deliberately steered away from the desolation to find a clearing that was still surrounded by life. Before retiring for the night, the women gathered in a circle to give thanks for the day. Sophia took Marcus' hand and said, "Join us." He stood up tentatively, holding on to Sophia's hand. They stood in a circle in silence. After several minutes, a light began to shine in their midst. Marcus could see it, although his eyes were now closed. It shone into him, filling him with warmth and peace. For the first time since he could remember, he felt a softness, perhaps even happiness. It was such a simple feeling, and it seemed to require no reason. Sophia began, "Beautiful Creator, thank you for this day. Thank you for your protection. Thank you for the life that surrounds us now. I ask you to be with us in our rest. Please guide our dreams so that we may wake up refreshed and inspired aspects of your creation. Thank you for blessing this journey and for making all things as they are." When Marcus opened his eyes, Sophia was looking at him. She smiled and squeezed his hand. The peace within him grew. He gazed at her in wonder. "I am a man made by obligation and duty," he said. "I have found satisfaction by working hard in the tradition of my ancestors." He stopped, looking for the right words. "But I have never felt as well as I do now. I feel new. I feel hopeful. I feel—" Sophia embraced him for a long time and then let him go. "I'm so glad," she said. All 5 travelers camped close together in the lush clearing. Marcus basked in the near presence of Sophia and the new light in his heart. The stream trickled from the night and into their dreams. Chapter 20. Growth. Thervius listened to the sound of his footsteps in the snow. With each step, the icy granules made a whisper around his boot. The river danced by in a rippling cadence that surrounded him. He sauntered swiftly to the duet of frozen and rushing melted water. His mind raced with all that had happened on the strange peak. Occasionally he stooped down to feel his calf where the ice wolf had bitten him. The pants were ripped and stained with blood, but his flesh had completely healed. The skin was golden with the rigorous walk, and not a scar was to be seen. Thervius wondered if the cut had been real, and a quick memory of the pain affirmed that it was. As the river widened, a subtle ribbon of purple bobbed at the banks. The swirling green and blue streaks increased as the volume of water grew. It was dazzling. All the colors moved fast and faster as Thervius' journey grew longer. He was captivated. He couldn't take his eyes off the increasing melt and its colors. Walking along the river felt right. The vibrant movement was a delight compared to the somber interior of the forest. As he descended, the surrounding trees were becoming taller. Their branches were adorned with epaulets of snow that glowed in the rising moonlight. It did not occur to Thervius that he should sleep. Energy still moved radiantly through his body, and the chilled air was invigorating. The confluence turned into a moving darkness, its depths a velvety black, and its surface dancing with glints of celestial light. As morning approached, Thervius began to hear the distant roar of falling water. It was an ominous sound, suggesting that the ease of his current walk would soon end. It signaled the meeting with something profoundly and severely massive. Thervius could feel its magnificence taunting him to witness, daring him to know its power. In the early morning light, Thervius began to make out a horizon on the waterline. By now the river was wide enough on which a ship could sail, but as Thervius squinted his eyes, he saw the flat line of water, then sky, and then the light of its curl downward. It was dropping, and the sound unsettled him to the core. Not even his native ocean had ever been so terrifying. The ground grew rocky under his feet, and he began passing massive boulders of dark gray and black. His walk slowed to steps taken one at a time. The trail was narrowing, and there was hardly any place to move between the river and the boulders to his right. The current sped up next to his feet. It was the quiet speed that exploded into a roar as it rushed over the cliff. Thervius edged forward and peered down the long drop. Although the river descended into a wide lake, it appeared as a pond from the top of the cliff. The mist flooded his eyes. He gasped and jumped back. There was nowhere left to walk. A rock wall rose up indifferently to his right, and the great river was throwing itself downward to his left. He would have to go back and find another route to the base of the waterfall. But before he could turn, a demonic screech ripped at his ears, and everything went black as he was engulfed in a gust of hot soot. He choked on the burning ash and screamed as heat overtook his body. The great force pummeled into him, and Thervius stumbled forward. His feet lost the stone path, and everything turned upside down. Now he was falling through the mists, falling in a searing cloud of ash that was trying to rip him apart. It bit and pulled at his skin. It pulled at his limbs and hair. Even more disturbing, it hissed and screeched his name maniacally. The force roiled around him as he fell. It grabbed him and pushed him up, trying to bring him away from the water. Then he would slip through and fall more. At times he hung painfully in the air. Thervius sobbed in agony and confusion. They fell suddenly and again hovered in midair. The violent dark cloud and the human victim. It yanked at him, trying to drag him back up to the ledge, but gravity was having its way, and at last they both fell into the icy water with a cruel slap. Thervius was thrust along the bottom by the current. The evil thing had fallen into the water with him, and the water was darkened with ash. The initial shocking chill immediately turned warm by the hot, evil presence. Thervius flailed at the tepid darkness, choking and struggling to the surface. At last he found the surge of water moving forward and ascended to the air. Immediately, the swift current threw him up against the side of a huge rock. Thervius tried to move away, but the water pummeled him against the rock again. He struggled until he could leverage the momentum of the river, swimming steadily ahead to avoid the next watery thrash. He paddled toward the center, where the flow was swift but calm. However, the water here was cold, devastatingly cold, and crystal clear. He looked down and could see a watery canyon under his feet. He saw the blue and green streaks in the submerged rock, and the ribbons of color swirling about him now. He felt his hands begin to grow numb and spun around looking for a place to get out. He saw a bank to the left and swam for it. Thervius ascended the colorful pebble beach, drenched and gasping. He looked around fearfully. His eyes looked back over the swift water to the churning white base of the waterfall and up the long, misty column of water that poured from the now barely perceptible ledge. It was so far away. Whatever had attacked him was gone. Somehow, the heat and ash went into the river with him. Thervius looked down at his coat. It was very nearly burned away. Just some fur and charred ribbons of leather remained. His hands, neck, and face were burnt too. The cold water had immediately minimized the heat, but he could still feel the beginnings of blisters. Now, for the first time in days, Thervius began to shiver. He was deeply cold. He walked up the beach and down the water line. As he realized his dangerous circumstances, he quickened his pace. He would have to keep moving to fight the lethal chill. The sun was rising higher in the sky, but it did not seem to help. The river now spread over a wide plain. The bank was giving a kind of birth, and so Thervius began to run. It was his only hope. His lungs expanded and ached with the invasion of cold air. He stumbled and then pushed himself back up. The sun ascended the sky and began inching toward the west. Thervius kept going. He was exhausted, but it was better than death. Keep moving, he commanded himself. Keep moving. Chapter 21. Dragons. Every dragon was different, not only in temperament, but also in their color. No two dragons had the same disposition or the same hue. Even two red dragons would vary in the tint or shade of their tone. So by late morning, the dragon gorge was filled with flying colors as the beasts flew to and from their nests. With their keen eyesight, they could always tell who was coming or going by the whirl of color in the air. But nobody had seen the flying deep green of their leader. Sedonai had not left his nest for days. He remained immobile in his nest. Something in his ancient heart was stirring. There was a sense of things in the world moving too fast. An old balance had fallen away, and a new one was forming. Everything shivered and swirled around the dragon, and his instinct was to stay very still. He felt like the last thread that prevented the entire world from becoming undone. He even kept his breathing slow and deliberate. The slightest movement he felt, and something would break. He lay curled up with his nose tucked into the curve of his foreleg. The rest of the dragon tribe was curious about what kept Sedonai in his nest. They flew by at a respectful distance, craning their necks to see what their leader was doing. Occasionally, some dropped mounds of purple river foam into the nest, or gifts of gems from the river banks. Sedonai understood their devotion, but he found the sudden movement about him unsettling. He was holding something down, holding something that wanted to break free. Even the familiar cliff felt unsure, like it wanted to give up being solid. The stone didn't feel as dense as it used to. Sometimes it almost shimmered when he looked at it. He thought of his ancestors who built his nest, forming all the branches and mud together and then bending it up to the cliff. He wondered if they had ever felt so unsure, and if so, what had they done about it? He had kept their rhythms, their traditions, but someone had started it all. Someone had to be the pioneer. Someone built the first nest. Someone took the first journey to an unnamed continent. Someone had decided that every dragon should do so. Was it enough to perpetuate the decisions of dragons long ago? He had kept the rhythm, kept the balance. He had been a hub around which the tribe could flourish. But what was happening now? He didn't know it yet, but he felt the difference. He didn't know how to respond, and so he kept still, very still. Suddenly, the entire ancient nest shifted. Sedonai bolted upright and peered over the edge to see clumps of old river mud descending into the churning water. Everything inside him clutched at the stillness, trying to find the fulcrum, the still center, the point of peace. But the nest lurched again, and something snapped behind him. Sedonai spun around and saw that a cliff hold had given away, and the nest was coming loose from the rock. He stared in disbelief. 2 more snaps, and the entire nest spilled forward, throwing the great green dragon out over the river. Sedonai fell, a mass of wings and tail and claws, until finally the stillness within him moved and jolted his whole body. He began beating his wings rapidly. His descent slowed until at last he was hovering just above the swirling torrent of the great river. The blue and green and red danced under fierce claws. Just then, a huge crack resounded through the gorge, and his nest let go of the cliff completely. Sedonai jerked around just as it came crashing down into the river, drenching him in the fresh, cold water. Sedonai's wings faltered, and he nearly fell completely in the churn of dissolving mud and loosening branches. He kicked and thrust himself high up into the air with a speed he hadn't flown in years. All the dragon's eyes were on him. Some peered, stunned from their nests, and others hovered with enough presence of mind to keep themselves aloft. Sedonai flew straight up into the sky with a strange mix of anger and ecstasy burning through him. He roared, and the fire shot out his body and out over the river. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, and suddenly all the nests began to give way. The holds on the cliff popped in an artillery of sound. Chaos descended from the cliffs. Dragons of every color tumbled into the air. Parents snatched the young ones up by their necks and flew up to the top of the cliff. Some didn't make it in time and dropped right into the water. They flailed awkwardly before rising back up above the raging currents. The gorge was a reverse storm of multicolored dragons, all soaring up from their falls. One by one, nests crashed into the river until it was muddy, a stew of branches and generations of dragon debris. The cliffs seemed to sigh from the freedom of their burdens, and snow drifted gently into the water. The tribe hovered in the air together, and no one said a word. They all looked at Sadonai, waiting for his next move. He opened his jaw and roared again, jolting everyone out of their shock. The fire barreled into the sky and lit up their stunned faces. Their wings flapped in slow motion, just enough to keep them aloft. Sedonai sped around them all and bellowed again. His mind was now blank with fire. Everyone continued to stare until bright yellow Mindian bolted up and roared into the sky. Dalfric and Mara did the same. Then suddenly all the dragons were filling the air with fire. Not out of anger, but out of despair, freedom, burning, and bizarre delight. Chapter 22. Green. Marcus was in a deep sleep. His eyes fluttered, taken in all the colors and sharpness of his dream. Underneath his eyelids, his dream eyes gazed down an endless range of mountains. They were covered with myriad stands of pointy evergreens. Their arrowed tips pointed up toward clear blue skies and a bright, clear sun. He hovered in the air, and the frigid cold swirled around his bare feet. But when he looked down at them, they weren't feet, but golden talons. He looked to each side and saw a striking pair of golden wings. He felt the current buffeting him and realized he was an eagle. He flew swiftly around the endless peaks until he came to the mountain he knew as home. He recognized it by its shape and feel. On the flank where his village was, he saw a massive fire. The entire settlement was burning. He soared swiftly, terror coursing through his heart. The demon had returned. But as he grew closer, he saw that the entire settlement was intact, and the people walked through the flames as if they didn't know that everything was on fire. Trees stood tall and green. The flames moved rhythmically to the growing sound of music. They danced around every person, animal, and building. The people behaved as if it were a festival day. Children ran amidst the cabins. Men and women talked casually in the pathways, and brightly colored banners hung from the longhouse. Goats grazed peacefully at the perimeter, and dogs slept before open doors. The eagle eyes took everything in as the terror gave way to bewilderment. Marcus opened his eyes. The sunlight of a fully realized morning flooded the green grove. The warm tones of a stringed instrument wafted through the air. He sat up. He had been the last to wake. He looked down toward the stream and saw Lydia playing music. She plucked the strings gently. It was the most loving sound Marcus had ever heard. It seemed to accompany the sound of the stream and the air moving through the canopy overhead. He lay there, enchanted, until he thought of Sophia. He looked around. Where was she? He stood up and stretched. Cleo had set fruit and nuts out for everyone to eat. She and Dario were now talking up the stream from where Lydia was playing the music. Marcus wandered dreamily around the camp, every pore still taking in the sounds. This is a beautiful place. Marcus spun around. Sophia stood there, her feet wet from the stream. The chieftain took her in and nodded awkwardly. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she asked. "Yes," Marcus said tentatively. His mind was with his people and resuming their journey toward them. This conversation was taking him by surprise, but his decorum propelled him to add, "It's so green." Sophia eyed him. "I think we should stay here," she said. Now Marcus was fully awake. He cleared his throat. "That's not possible," he said. "We must keep going." "Why?" Sophia looked at him plainly, every note of her voice drenched in her benevolent nature. Marcus couldn't believe what he was hearing. He'd watched her ready them for their journey and command the other priestesses to their work on the land. They had set out so resolutely, and now she was suggesting they stay here and play in the sunlight, a full day's walk away from his people. "My village has just been attacked," he said gravely. He wanted her to feel the seriousness of the situation. "My people need me. We have to get back as soon as possible." Again, Sophia looked at him respectfully. Her voice was simple and earnest. "Why?" Marcus was stunned. He trusted his own logic, and so did his people. Nobody ever questioned his reasons for anything. He was always as clear and direct as he could be, and yet this woman did not understand him. Sophia smiled warmly. "Your people need their leader, but they need your peace and not your sense of alarm. My priestesses need to be ready to teach. They need a place to pause. This place can hold us for a while, and what we gather here will be of use to your people. I promise. We will leave the day after tomorrow." Then she turned and walked with bare feet back toward the stream. The other three women continued with what they were doing. Marcus stood there aghast. Anger stewed within him, and it took all his strength to contain it. The thought occurred to him that he could just leave these women here and let them have their leisure alone. His people had been besieged, and these women acted like nothing was wrong. Marcus spun around several times, deciding what he should do. He had promised that he would return as soon as possible, and yet he had also promised a remedy. These women were it, and so he had to wait for them. He had no choice but to stay, and he knew it. His mind pounded against the inside of his skull. He remembered when he had always contained the answer, the remedy, and he had never had to wait on anyone else for help. He wished it were so now. He breathed deeply and walked back to his blanket. He lay down and stared up into the green canopy. The dappled light danced across his face and warmed him. Birds twittered about the leaves, and he watched a squirrel hurry from branch to branch. The music and stream continued their duet. After some time, Marcus closed his eyes. He drifted back to sleep. When Marcus awoke, the full sun had heated the grove into complete stillness. Only the water danced lightly nearby. He was deeply warm, and a thin perspiration suffused his skin. He was rested to the core. Marcus let his eyes take in the afternoon calm. The birds and small animals were quiet, finished with their business of the morning. Something in the distance trilled intermittently. He sat up, fresh with wonder. All of the women were gone. The packs and bedrolls lay about, and the mules lazed under a nearby tree. He was completely alone. There were no priestesses, nobody needing his attention, no assistant, and no option to hurry to the next responsibility. He stood up and walked over to the glittering stream. The water moved in velvety ribbons over the rocks. He touched the surface of the flow. It was cool and clean. Marcus looked up over the sun-warmed depths. Smooth boulders created a pristine basin, and trout circled calmly in the clear water. He suddenly felt the contrast between the stream and his unbathed, disaster-tinged body. The soot, the anger, the uncertainty, the death, the sadness and desperation. It all clung to his skin and clothes. Marcus undid his vest and laid it on a nearby rock. He took off his shirt and then his boots and pants. He stood naked over the water and stepped in. The sweet coolness ran through his toes and over his feet. He walked further, his bones splaying over the rocks and the flow moving up his legs as he stepped deeper. At last he bent his knees and let himself float over the sage-green depths. The cool water rushed around him, cleaning every pore, every chafed and weary part of him. He fanned out his arms and felt the silky swirl around his fingers. He drifted on his back and squinted into the sun until his eyelids shut. With his ears just below the surface, he listened to this pulsing artery of the land. He heard its confidence in itself, how it flowed happily to the ocean, and how every spring the tributaries swelled with melted snow. He felt its pride in supporting the fish, birds, insects, and all the other animals that thrived nearby. It coursed with purpose and life, and it joyfully held him up to the sun now. Marcus drifted in gratitude. He felt like he'd stepped between worlds, between the women and their strange intentions, and the devastation of his people and their village. Both seemed very far away, and for a second he felt the mantle of his leadership loosen around his body, and the water cleanse everything beneath it. Then Marcus opened his eyes. Something was moving in the water. He swam upright and treaded, looking around. At the bank, where he had entered the stream, Sophia kneeled over the edge. In her hands were his clothes. She dunked them into the water and scrubbed and rinsed, scrubbed and rinsed. He watched her in amazement. She sat the pants on a rock to dry, and then his vest. At last, she held up the shirt to study its improvement. It dripped heavily into the water. Her eyes went from the shirt to Marcus, where she found him watching her. She smiled calmly, but said nothing. She wrung out the clothes and laid them to dry in the sun. Then she held up a blanket for him to see, set it down by the stream, and turned back through the trees. Marcus hovered in the water, looking after where she had gone. He went to the bank, emerged slowly from the water, and wrapped the blanket around him. Then for the rest of the day, he accompanied his clothes out under the sun.